I'm pretty sure most people here can agree that vintage guitars are awesome. However, they are not for everybody. There's definitely a lot of reasons why you wouldn't want to own a vintage guitar. So anyways, here are a few reasons why you shouldn't buy a vintage guitar. And again, take this in mind from somebody who loves and owns two vintage guitars. This being my 1979 Les Paul Custom, as well as my 1987 Kramer F6000. So both of these guitars are over 35 years old, this one being over 40 something years old. So take what I say with a grain of salt. I love vintage guitars, however, that doesn't mean they're perfect. There's definitely things you have to look out for when buying a vintage guitar. The first one being is it's sometimes pretty cool to be the only owner of a guitar. For example, my PRS over there, well, it's technically my dad's, but we are the only owners of that guitar. We bought it brand new, no one else has really played it other than us two. So every single story that guitar carries is going to come from us since, again, we're the original owners of the guitar. But while with the vintage guitar, such as this one here, it probably has way more owners just because it's significantly older. Now, that's not the worst thing in the world. However, sometimes you want the guitar's stories to only come from you, and that's pretty cool to say. There's a lot of guitars in my collection that I am the only owner of, and I would like to eventually give those to my kids. That way it's a family heirloom, you know. Oh, like my kids can say, my dad bought this guitar, you know, when he was 16, 17 years old, and he owned it ever since to the day he died. I think that's a pretty cool thing to say, as opposed to this, when it came from someone else, and probably someone else before that, and maybe even someone else before that. No, yeah, that's a very nitpicky thing, but it is a little bit true, and it's something to keep in mind. It is cool to be the only owner of a guitar. Now, kind of an extension off of that is that every guitar is eventually going to turn vintage. Every guitar, even vintage ones, started off as a brand new guitar. With that being said, there's a lot of other cons, which I'll get into in the other parts of the video. There's a lot of cons to vintage guitars, so is it worth it? You could just buy a new one and just wait, and eventually it itself will be vintage. It itself will probably be one of the guitars that people are chasing and trying to find to go for that vintage feel. So eventually your guitar is going to turn vintage, regardless how old it is. This next con, along with price, which I'll go over later, is probably the biggest con when it comes to buying vintage guitars. And that is that it's kind of hard to prove the quality instrument, especially if you're buying one online. The guitars back then weren't quite as machine-made as they are now. With that being said, every guitar, especially the older they are, the worse it is, every guitar is going to feel quite a bit different, at least in comparison to the guitars now. Now, the process of making guitars much more automated. There's less room for error when it comes to human mistakes, so every guitar now is probably going to feel the same as the one next to it, as long as it's the same guitar, obviously. Well, back then, I played a couple 79 Gibsons, and they do feel a bit different from each other. Well, now, I played a couple of the new Les Pauls. It's Les Paul 50s, Les Paul 60s, and they all pretty much feel exactly the same as the one next to it. And so why that matters is sometimes you're gonna get duds. Sometimes you're gonna get a vintage guitar that's being sold for a reason. I got lucky with this one. I bought this one sight unseen online, and it's great. It's the best playing instrument I have. But that doesn't mean they're all gonna be like this. You're probably not always gonna get lucky. While if you buy a guitar new, it's pretty much guaranteed that it's gonna be a pretty dang good instrument. And with it being an older guitar, it's probably been played a lot, meaning it's probably a little bit more beat up and broken in, which isn't a problem for me, but for other people it might be. And also the frets. As you play guitar more and more and more, the frets are going to wear down. So don't be surprised if there's work you have to do to get the guitar back in a great playing shape. This guitar wasn't played much throughout its lifetime, so the frets are fine. But with my 1987 Kramer, the frets in the next couple years are probably going to need a refret. Now with that guitar, that's not a big deal. While with this guitar, if this thing needs a refret, that's going to be an issue. Gibsons have these fret nibs on the side here, and that makes refretting very difficult to do because you don't want to break those off. And if you do break them off, it tanks the value of the guitar. Now, if you're buying a guitar that already has been refretted, then great. It's probably in great shape, the frets probably feel fantastic, and you don't really have to worry about it because the value has probably already been dropped at that point, so it doesn't really matter. But if you're buying one that is completely stock with no refrets at all, that's something to keep in mind. The guitars are older, they've been played more, it might not be in the best shape. There are other issues you might have to worry about, that being the truss rod might be maxed out and the neck might even be twisted. And if you're buying it online, make sure you message your seller and ask them for pictures of the truss rod, as well as to make sure the neck isn't twisted at all, because that will completely ruin the value of the guitar, and you don't want to buy a guitar that has those issues without knowing it. But while if you buy a new guitar, the truss rod isn't going to be maxed out because it hasn't had enough time to change shape over the years to where you need to keep adjusting over and over again, as well as the neck, it's probably not going to get warped over it only being a couple months old. While if a guitar is 40-something years old, the chances of that happening are significantly higher. So that's definitely something you have to keep in mind. Now, this next possible issue with buying a vintage guitar is actually something that is an issue with my 1987 Kramer, and that is microphonic pickups. If you don't know what that means that the wax coating that are in pickups wears down, it becomes brittle, and the wax coating no longer works as it's supposed to. What this means is that those pickups now are significantly more sensitive than they're supposed to be. meaning you're going to be able to just talk into it as if it's a microphone. And the bigger issue with microphone and pickups is, especially if you have a lot of gain and you walk up close to your amp, it's going to feedback really, really badly because the pickups are so sensitive. Now, that's not the worst problem to have. It's very easy just to re-wax coat your pickups. It's not very expensive to do, but it's something that still has to be done if it is an issue. And obviously, the less issues, the better. Now, you're not going to have that issue with the new guitar, unless the pickups come from the factory not waxed, like some guitars, like the EF-M Casino. I don't believe those ones have been waxed just because they're meant to have that low gain, kind of more sensitive feel to the pickups, but that's a very rare case. So my 87 Kramer, I'm definitely going to have to take those in. There's also some issues with the electronics, just because they've probably messed around with so many times over the years, so that might be a video in the future of me fixing up that guitar, but that's the conversation for another time. And the last, and honestly the biggest issue with buying a vintage guitar is the price. This guitar here is by far the most expensive guitar in my collection. Is it my favorite? Yes. Do I regret buying it? Not in the slightest. However, it's still a really expensive guitar. And is this guitar necessarily better than a new Les Paul Custom? Probably not. If anything, it might be a slightly worse instrument. So is it worth that extra couple $1,000s to get the vintage title to it? To me, yes, because it is a guitar that I've always wanted. This with the exact specs that it is, the tobacco sunburst finish, the maple neck, the volute here. This is my dream guitar, so that's why I bought this. But again, that doesn't mean it's perfect. Like I said, it's an expensive guitar. And also, if you want to have a guitar with all original parts, you're gonna have to be willing to pay for it. Unfortunately, guitars aren't one of those things where you could upgrade the bridge or upgrade the pickups and it be more expensive. Guitars are one of those things, especially Gibson's, where it has to be all original in order to have its full value. So it is a way to save money to look for those guitars that have been modified over the years or have damage or things done to them. That way you're able to save a bit of money, if that doesn't bother you at all. But for me, I kind of want the guitar to be all original, and unfortunately, that means I had to pay the extra price for it. Tying back into what I was talking about earlier, all guitars are eventually going to turn vintage, meaning a lot of the times, especially with guitars that tend to go up in value, like Gibson's, the price is going to go up with it as well, which is a good thing. Unless you're the one trying to buy a used guitar, then that's when it becomes an issue. Is it worth it to me? Yes. However, are there risks involved? Yes, there are. But did this video deter you from buying a vintage guitar? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, feel free to click like, and if you loved it and you want to see more content from me, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video.